I dug out this old diving mask today to bring up the subject of diving stories. I have a lot of them. I was involved in murky water, skin diving, and scuba diving when I was a kid. Now, my brother introduced me to the sport of diving when I was in the 7th grade. I doubt if he even remembers it. But he was into scuba diving a little bit. And one day he took me to Weeki Wachee Springs, and we dove into a deep area in the river, in the Weeki Wachee River. And it was my first taste of scuba diving. Now, back then, there was no diving schools, there was no certification, there was nothing like that. You just bought a diving tank and threw it on your back and went. And equipment was rather crude. Scuba diving tanks were just bare tanks with a canvas strap on them. And the only regulator available was a U.S. diver's single-stage regulator with 2 hoses, the kind you see on the old movie Sea Hunt. Well, I was hooked immediately on diving, but being in the 7th grade, I wasn't able to do it very often because I lacked transportation, and my brother owned all the gear. But little by little, I began to collect gear. I bought myself a mask, and I bought myself a pair of fins, and I was determined to continue diving, and my brother had a spear gun. I was very interested in spearfishing. And because scuba diving was expensive and my brother owned the gear, I got into snorkel diving mostly. Although later on I got into scuba diving, and I have lots of stories about that too. As I got a little bit older, when I was in the 8th grade, I got a motorcycle, and I have stories about that as undapped. Once I got the motorcycle, my diving increased tremendously. In fact, if it was a Saturday or a Sunday and the weather was favorable, which it usually was in Florida, and I wasn't hooked into some kind of work or other duties that I had to do, I would take off for a place called Gandy Bridge, and I would go snorkel diving. Now, diving to me meant you got in the water as early as possible during the day, and you stayed in the water all day long. If you got cold, you got out and you warmed up in the sunshine for a while. But we were into murky water diving because the water in our area was murky. Now, when I say murky, when you see diving videos on TV or on YouTube, you see all this beautiful scenery with coral reefs and fish and sharks, and you can see 50 or 60 feet, sometimes 100 feet. That's not the way it was where we dove. We would mostly go to Gandy Bridge in St. Petersburg there, where I was born and raised. And we would go to Gandy Bridge, and at Gandy Bridge, you could see 6 feet. And that's it. After 6 feet, you couldn't see any further. On a really good day, you might see at the very best. I think the very best day I ever saw at Gandy feet, you could see 20 feet. 6 to 12 feet was it. And some days, it would only be 3 feet. And so you got used to diving in a murky surrounding. Now, this brought up some interesting fears because, you would read books about sharks and about barracudas, and you would get all scared, and then you go murky water diving, and you'd be out there and you can't see anything. And so all the time you're going like this, wondering, what's sneaking up behind me, looking behind you. And it was strange. Now, Gandy Bridge was an interesting place to dive. You can Google Gandy Bridge and read the history of it online. They have a pretty good history of it online. But in my diving days, there were 2 bridges. There was the old bridge that stretched across Tampa Bay there from St. Petersburg to Tampa. And then there was the new bridge. And now the old bridge is totally gone, and they have another new bridge. So it's quite different today than it was, and the whole area today is rather park-like. Back then it was totally undeveloped. You pull into the gravel parking area, and there was a seawall there, and you could jump in the water. You had to be very careful at Gandy Bridge because there were oysters everywhere, and oysters are like razor blades. And if you step on them wrong, you cut your foot. So you learned how to walk very carefully on the oysters, and you always had special fins that had a full shoe fin, had a bottom to them. You couldn't use these fins that just had a strap. You couldn't get in the water without being cut. But you'd very carefully walk across the oysters until you could see the water where it was deep enough, and then you'd dive out there and splash into the water. Now at Gandy Bridge there was strong current, and you could always dive on one side or the other side of the bridge, depending on which way the current was going. And certain times of the day, if you got there at dead current, you could dive right underneath the bridge and there would be no current. But the current at Gandy Bridge was strong. It was upward to 6 knots, and you couldn't swim against it, but you could swim with it. And we learned to dive there and actually play in the current and use the current for our own purposes. We would get out and walk way around the seawall, dive in, and then we would let the current bring us around all the way underneath the bridge until we got to the other side where there was no current. Then we could get out and do it again. But we used to spearfish that area, but it was all murky water. Sometimes we would go to the Sunshine Skyway to dive, and it was the water there was more clear, and we liked it. Average there was 12 feet, and on a really good day you might see 20 or 30 feet. But the water was deep there, 50 feet, but we could dive 50 feet without any problem. And sometimes we went to what was called the $1 Million Pier in St. Petersburg. It's gone now. It went through several rebuilds, and finally they just tore it down completely. But at the $1 Million Pier, you could dive out under the pier, or you could go out on this nice rock jetty. But again, you were always kind of in fear, looking around, because you'd read these books about sharks, and you were always wondering what's sneaking up on you. But we never had any attacks or mishaps. Mostly we got cut by oyster shells, or maybe stung by a jellyfish occasionally, sometimes bit by a crab that we didn't see underneath a rock. But that was murky water diving. That's the way it was. Diving was a passion, a great passion in my life. And all through my junior high and high school years, anytime it was a good day, I would be out in the water and try to spend sometimes all day in the water. When I got into scuba diving later, we hit the springs and the caves in Florida, and there are lots of beautiful springs and caves, and I have lots of stories about those. But this is my introduction to diving, and that's all I have to say about that.